Remember these? Stick around and you'll watch me make my own homemade sit and spin. After having torn down the old house next door, I wound up with a great big pile of salvaged lumber. Seems like I ought to be able to find something for the toy in here. You deal with reclaimed lumber and you're going to be pulling nails. This piece had the right width for the handle, but I wasn't sure what kind of wood it was. It's kind of greenish, might be poplar, I think. It was just barely long enough to pass through the surface planer. I have a circle cutting jig for my bandsaw, but for smaller ones you're better off just tracing them and freehanding it. Here I'm cutting a piece of square stock from which I'll turn the post. There's a bunch of ways of taking off the corners before you start turning it. I prefer to use a draw knife. This board was a bit wide and wobbly to run over my jointer, so I'm going to have to rip it. I'm going to mark the high corners so I can plane them off by hand. Seems strange to hand plane it before you jointer plane it, but it saves you a lot of trouble. I'm gluing up the hard maple base that the rotating part is going to sit on top of. My dad made me this circle cutting jig for the bandsaw. It comes in handy when you're cutting real big circles like this. So I have my bottom all set to go. I have the router and a very rudimentary router compass, and the bit in it is a round nose like this one here that'll give me the rounded track that the marble can follow. These marbles are all slightly different size, but I can pick through them and find ones that are uniform enough.
Tracy. I was like, what's wrong with you, Mom? And that right there made the butthole scratch. But I said, I'm for the jungle. I'm gonna talk my...
The part I'm cutting here is going to be the spacer. The marbles will sit in each one of those holes and keep them separate from each other. Happens to us all. I'm cutting plywood for the revolving seat here. What I want to do here is take what's going to be the handle on top of the sit and spin and put a groove along the underside of it to make it easier for a kid to grab. Put a cutoff of the same thickness right next to it so that the router would have more surface area to sit on. So how to drill a hole with a Forstner bit that's perfectly plumb. Through a little research I found how if you just take a piece of stock, drill a hole that's perfectly sized to the shaft of your Forstner bit, and then make a recess for the cutter, you can hold that against the stock as you're drilling, and that'll keep it plumb. I found this setup awkward because that's a two-handed drill. If I had it to do again, I would have set it on the floor, stepped on the jig, and had both hands free. And here I am drilling the seat the same way with a slightly larger bit. I'm adding this plywood to the base just to give it a little extra thickness to hold that post onto. I want to put an apron around the seat, so I'm cutting thin strips of ash to wrap around it. These ash are thin enough to bend on their own. I don't need to steam them. I held the ends with clamps and put little brad nails every few inches. You have these places where the trim is butted up against each other. We don't want those to pull off. So what we're going to do is take a skinny piece of the same strip and put on the back side of it and glue it and clamp it to hold it together from the inside. Well folks, I lost my footage of the glue up, but the only little trick about that was when I pushed the post into its mortise, I used these quarters as a spacer just to give the top room to rotate. Now it's time to go play with it.